Welcome to The Good Source. This is our first interview for this new project. And I've got with me this morning Dr Stephen Chavura. Welcome, Steve. It's great to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Now, I actually think you are one of Australia's leading conservative intellectuals.
It's very nice of you to say.
Well, you're not only are you well read and obviously writing lots of books at a very high level, but you're very engaged in the public square. You're very outspoken in terms of your courage. You've been involved in Australian Christian lobby. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that journey for you in terms of academia and your role as a Christian in speaking in the public square.
Yeah, well, I've always had an interest in politics, in what's going on in Australia. I grew up in a household where, certainly my father spoke a lot about politics. We watched the news every night. And even as an undergraduate, I used to write the odd letter to the local paper on various issues and things like that. I was interested in talking about politics at university. I had friends on the right. I had friends on the anarchist Marxist left. In fact, I loved hanging out with my anarchist Marxist friends. In fact, I went to uni at Western Sydney University at the Bankstown campus, and it had the reputation of being the most radical campus in Australia. They took pride in that. In fact, they renamed the bar the Bakunin Bar after the great sort of Russian anarchist of the 19th century, Mikhail Bakunin. So it was radical, and I was friends with the Marxists, and I learned a lot from them. But then when I sort of started postgraduate work and teaching, I was asked to speak at a local Christian Democratic Party branch meeting. And I spoke at the meeting, and as it turned out, it was also a meeting where they were looking for a candidate for the particular electorate of that branch. And someone actually came up to me and just said, "Look, would you consider standing as a candidate for the Australian Christian lobby? For the Christian Democratic Party." And I thought about it, and the big thing against it was at that point I was trying to sort of pursue an academic career. And, standing as a candidate just for the lower house, there was no expectation that I'd actually get elected. But standing as a candidate for the Christian Democratic Party was not something that you'd want to put on an academic resume. It's not going to bode well with the diversity representative on the selection committee. But then I thought, well, something, I say no to every chance I have to be a Christian in the public sphere until I get a tenured job in a university. I mean, that might not happen for 10 years. So for 10 years, I just say nothing. And then you get your tenured job, then the fear is, I'm tenured now, but, it'd be really good if I could make professor. And, it's going to be hard to make professor if I'm a sort of an outspoken conservative and an outspoken Christian. So I'll just keep a low profile till I make professor. And you basically wind up spending the next 25 years not using your gifts to the fullest in terms of speaking truth. And so at that moment, I kind of just made a decision, I'm going to do this because I think it's the right thing to do. I like the party. I want to do this. I want to help them. And what happens, happens. And that was my attitude. And it's basically been my attitude for the last 18 years of teaching in one academic institution or another. Is it bravery? I don't know that it's bravery. I think it's more a case of if I was to compromise on something like that, I just don't think I could sleep at night. So I think it's more just a question of being able to look myself in the mirror and not feel like a complete fraud.
So it's a matter of personal integrity for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Because what am I supposed to do? Encourage other Christians to speak out in the public sphere and yet be silent myself? I just can't do that.
I've often refer people to a quote that you said to me once, that in your time as a lecturer at university, there's lots of Christians that are willing to die for Jesus, but very few are willing to look foolish for him. Talk us through that. Why is that the case?
Well, something, that there's just no shortage of Christians with PhDs, of very intelligent Christians. And look, you've got Christians in the universities as well. What I think there is a shortage of, though, are Christians who are prepared to say things that are unpopular among the intellectual elites. It's not that Christians are necessarily not prepared to be unpopular. They're prepared to be unpopular often among conservatives, but they're often not prepared to be unpopular among those more left of centre.
Who they respect and they want their respect.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, Christians over the last, for a couple of generations, have in a sense kind of been groomed by an abusive left to love them, even though the left will never ever say anything good to them. They'll just keep abusing them back. But there's this desperate desire among many Christian intellectuals just not to appear foolish in the eyes of the left. And so they'll often talk about things like climate change, refugees, and they'll be really outspoken about this. They'll chain themselves up to fences. Other things, well, Black Lives Matter is the big thing now, so they'll be really vocal about that. But then on something like abortion, or something like transgenderism, or something like same-sex marriage, boy, will they pull out the most incredible distinctions and reasons not to be nearly as vocal on that as they are on all the other things. And they'll come up with brilliant, interesting arguments as to why that's the case. But you just can't help but notice that all the things that their conscience compels them to talk about just so happen to be things that the left are really, really excited about. And all the things that their conscience and their intellect says, well, you know, we don't want to be vocal about this one for these sorts of reasons. This isn't the hill to die on, that kind of thing. Quite coincidentally, they are the things, they are the causes that are absolutely reviled and hated by the cultural left. I don't think it's a complete coincidence. I do actually think that there's this weird longing for intellectual Christians, that is, Christians who fancy themselves as intellectuals, not to appear foolish in the eyes of the cultural elites. But I will say here right now that these people would die for Jesus. There is no doubt in my mind they would die for Jesus, but they would not be embarrassed for him. When it comes to...
They also seem to say, if I was at the time of slavery, African-American slavery in America, I would have spoken up. If I was at the time of Hitler during Nazi Germany, I would have spoken up. Is it because it's just that was safe to say now? It's things also that the left are affirming?
Well, who knows whether they would have spoken up or not. But, I mean, Robert P. George in Princeton has a very interesting sort of thought experiment where he I forget exactly what it is actually, but he basically asks people to put their hand up if they think if they were back in Nazi Germany they would have spoken up about the treatment of the Jews, and of course the overwhelming majority of the class puts its hand up, and then he says how many of you right now have spoken up about, and he lists a bunch of injustices, maybe even including abortion. I'm not sure. How many of you have sort of gone to a rally? How many of you have written something to a politician? How many of you have actually done something that either takes time or that exposes you to public, that exposes you to the public that you are in favour or against this cause? And the number of hands that go up are much fewer. And then he says to them, you know something, why would you think that if you were around back then, you would be any more active or any braver than you are now? And it's an interesting thought experiment. I mean, we can say, we have all sorts of vanities about who we really are. And, who knows what we would have really been like somewhere back in Nazi Germany.
It seems to me in the last decade, there's been an increasing polarisation in politics in the West, especially even here in Australia, between the left and the right.
Yeah, so I prefer to think of it as more an acceleration.
Okay.
So what's happened in the last 10 years is an acceleration of a trend that's been taking place since the late 1960s. And there are a lot of books written on this over the last sort of 40 years. In fact, sort of, one American political scientist wrote an article in the American Journal of Political Science in about 1979. And he was pointing out that basically by the late 1970s, what we're seeing is this growing rift in the differences between the values of the educated and the non-educated. And he sort of, I think he wound up coining the term post-materialism, sort of the idea that when you have a class of people who basically have all the things that they need, then they stop worrying about things like the economy because they're doing fine, and they start focusing on other kinds of things like the environment, like racial issues, like sexuality and gender and things like that. It's a term that's still used to this day, post-materialism. But this particular political scientist, so he's writing this 10 years after you have the sort of the cultural revolutionary period of the late 1960s. And so, look, what's going on? Sort of the history of the present polarization is a long history. I mean, you could take it back a long. You could probably take it back to the Reformation with the split between Protestants and Catholics. I'm not going to take it back that far. But what I will say is that certainly, you know, in the 1950s and the 1960s, you have a sort of a rise in angst among teenagers. There were books written on this at the time. The Lonely Crowd by David Reisman was a very famous book which came out in 1950 about just how the American character is changing and the rise of this phenomenon like the angsty teenager who is kind of directionless, feels alienated. And you sort of saw it in films of the 1950s like Rebel Without a Cause. And you know, what's causing this? Who knows? I mean, quite possibly prosperity. That is, and you might think, why would prosperity make people all angsty and anxious? Well, because with prosperity comes an abundance of choice of things that you can do with your life. You don't have to just do the same job your mother and father did. There are all sorts of other things that you can do. And so with choice comes a kind of anxiety. What am I going to make of myself? And that's sort of one of the sociological explanations for this. And religion during the 1950s, all around the world, is actually quite strong. It goes through a real revival during World War II. Historians write about this. And yet there is a kind of angstiness emerging among the youth. But then in the 1960s, combine that sort of anxiety among the youth with quite radical ideas that are really starting to come into the universities around that time as well. And basically varieties of Marxism, existentialism, are coming into the universities. And with prosperity, more students than ever are going into the universities. In Australia too, Robert Menzies, Prime Minister from 1949 to 1966, expands the university sector in Australia, and many more Australians start going to universities. And so they start going through these institutions with quite radical ideas. And the radicalisation of the universities is something that's being pointed out by Menzies himself during the 50s and 60s, but it's also hinted at in Donald Horne's very famous book, The Lucky Country, written in 1964, where he says that, you know, the conservative academic, there are still few of them there, but they're kind of quaint vestiges of the past. He says the average academic now is basically hates the Liberal Party and laments the state of the Labor Party. And basically what he's saying is that academics are becoming increasingly radical. This is from the mid-1960s. So you've got this situation where you've got angsty youth, you've got youth with more money than previously, post-World War II economic boom. Universities are expanding, more youth are going into the universities, especially in America as well, and they're being exposed to radical ideas, but then the bomb hits, Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War kind of channels all that angst and those radical ideas into a definite cause. And you cannot underestimate the impact that the Vietnam War had on culture all around the West. What it did was it sort of took movements that were sort of politely asking for more rights, and it radicalized them and turned them into liberation movements calling for the whole dismantling of the system. That is, the Vietnam War basically made Marxism plausible on a very wide and popular level. And to the point where you get a song like John Lennon's Imagine coming out in the very early 70s, I think it was, which is basically a Marxist anthem. You cannot read the lyrics of Imagine and understand what Marxism is and not just see Marxism.
And that's strange because the Vietnam War was really essentially against communism. And so why is it that, America lost the war in a sense militarily. It didn't succeed. But it seems that Marxism, cultural Marxism, has since come into our society in the West. Why is that?
Well, because, look, here's the thing. There are a whole bunch of forces sort of shaping institutions today, and what we might call cultural Marxism is one of them. In terms of sort of the ideological forces that are sort of circulating today that are shaping things, you've got something like cultural Marxism, which I'll define in a second. But then there's this other weird thing. It's kind of sort of therapeuticism or something like that. It's this
therapeutic moral deism?
Well, I've heard that expression, therapeutic moral deism. Yes, we can go with therapeutic moral deism, but it's just this emphasis on being healthy, and especially being emotionally and mentally healthy. This emphasis on mental health. And then the other thing is really sort of good old-fashioned liberal sort of individualism, me first, the big me, and that kind of thing. Now, all of these things are distinguishable from one another, and yet at the same time, arguably, they all kind of work together a little bit as well. So just because you're one of them doesn't mean that you haven't got other parts of them all together. And that's sort of, there's a sort of, the fallacy is that what's shaping institutions and what's shaping minds and what's generating some things out there that look really bad, like riots, for example, that it has to be just one force and that's it. But that's not the case. It can be several forces. And so when someone correctly points out that, something like the same-sex marriage movement, but that's about people just wanting the right to marriage and rights. That's a language of liberalism, and therefore it's liberalism driving that and nothing else. That's a total fallacy because historically what happens is you can have several intellectual movements feeding into something. People aren't
monolithic.
They're not monolithic, and they're not philosophy textbooks. Where you have a different chapter separated from it. We're not like that. And so very often what you have are various intellectual discourses and ways of thinking, making things happen. And certainly one of them today is this thing called cultural Marxism. Now, you can trace the history of cultural Marxism in some respects, back to Karl Marx himself, obviously, the 19th century German philosopher, and various sort of expressions of Marxism after Marx dies, French existentialist expressions of Marxism, which go on to be rather influential in the origins also of sort of the postmodern movement, more sort of German Frankfurt School expressions of Marxism, and then Anglophone expressions of Marxism, all of them slightly different from the other, being influenced by different strains of thought. Freud, for example, goes and influences Marxists as well. It's all very complex, it's all very messy, but it's there. It sort of happened. And basically, by the time you get to the 1980s, there is this well-entrenched way of thinking among some academics, often academics in cultural studies departments in universities, which basically says society is really just a collection of struggles between oppressors and oppressed. Very much like what Marx said, that society is really just a struggle between the rich and those who have nothing. And then they'll say, but the struggles are not just about class. They may all have their origins in economic class, but the struggles are much more various than class. The struggles are race. The struggles are gender. Increasingly, particularly with the work of Foucault. Yes, Foucault is a postmodernist, but even postmodernism itself, in some ways, in its emphasis on power and struggle, really resonates with historical Marxism. And again, postmodernism as an ideology, and some postmodernists in France were sort of disillusioned Marxists.
Okay, so let's take an example. Black Lives Matter. Is that an expression of what you're talking about here, of cultural Marxism.
Yes, I think it is. Now, Black Lives Matter, if you go to its website, you won't explicitly see it talking about Karl Marx. And why would it? You know, Americans are generally pretty skittish about Marxism and communism, so you're not going to sort of get many people jumping on your bandwagon if you say, hey guys, we're Marxists or we're cultural Marxists. And that's the thing, the term cultural Marxism is not necessarily used by cultural Marxists any more than, you know, for example, Christians love to point out how many people today on the left, or just many people today, believe in things like human rights, gender equality, the rationality of science. And they'll say, hey guys, did you know that ultimately that comes from and is an expression of Christianity?
Yeah.
Now, only a fool would respond and say, oh, but those people don't call themselves Christians, or those people don't say that what they're saying has anything to do with Christianity, therefore it doesn't. I mean, that's a crazy argument. Yeah, history is much more complex than that. We're much more complex than that. We're often influenced by modes of thinking that we're not even aware of. They shape us without us even knowing it.
Yeah.
And cultural Marxism is no different.
Okay.
But say Black Lives Matter is very much basically where
I think, Steve, just sorry to interrupt you, but I would think a lot of people out there, even a lot of Christian people, would be saying, look, Black Lives Matter in that we're all made in the image of God. We're all equal to one another. So what's wrong with that?
Well, because what they've described is Christianity, not Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter says nothing about being created in the image of God.
Right.
Black Lives Matter basically says that all the problems experienced by African Americans and all minorities in America and around the world is basically the cause of white men. Black Lives Matter, I mean, sort of when Karl Marx spoke about an oppressive economic system which needs to be overthrown, cultural Marxists talk about an oppressive culture that needs to be overthrown. And in that respect, it's really an analogue with Marxism. Now, what do they mean by an oppressive culture? They mean the culture that's been created over the last sort of 500 years and more by white men, a culture that favours whiteness, heterosexuality, Christianity, probably other things that don't immediately come to mind. Binary gender norms, you're either male or female. They basically say this culture that we've inherited has been created to serve the interests only of one class of people. Therefore, and you can't just nicely appeal to the people who've created this culture, ratbags like you and me, although I'm a slightly lighter shade of skin than you.
Speak for yourself, Whitey.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, you've got obviously a false racial consciousness about you, and you.
Well, my story is an interesting one because I have a Kanaka background who were brought over from the Solomon Islands and the South Seas as slaves on the sugarcane plantation. And if I can see why a lot of people that have a similar sort of a background sort of really jump and identify with this whole oppressive culture. But for me, I don't see racism as being systemic in society. In fact, I think of the opportunities I have is a great sign that it's not systemic. What's your take on that?
Well, we can come to that in a second because that's an interesting question on systemic racism. But so with Black Lives Matter, again, its job is this, and when you go to the website, it's about gender, it's about sexuality, as well as race. It really is a comprehensive...
transgenderism.
It's a comprehensive worldview on what is wrong in society. And what is the solution? It's basically to tear down the culture. Now, how do you tear down a culture? Now, because what is culture? Where is it? Well, it's kind of everywhere. And culture is something that is passed along in the stories that we are told, in the images that we see, in the things that we hear from one another.
In the monumental statues we build.
In the statues that we build. In the curricula in our schools. So how do you change culture? Well, you pull down the statues. You get in and change the curricula in the schools. You make sure that certain ideas aren't heard. So you deplatform people. Now, of course, deplatforming is a very quaint way to stop people from hearing ideas.
This is the whole cancel culture.
Cancel culture, that's right. But we've got the internet now, so what do you do with that? Well, you basically...
you deplatform people.
Well, you can deplatform on the internet. You can mess around with algorithms to make sure that certain ideas don't come up when you do searches and things like that. The point is what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter and also with certain expressions of the LGBTQ movement is an attempt basically to overthrow a prevailing culture and replace it with something else that's kind of meant to be a sort of a perfect kind of culture, a culture of inclusivity and diversity. It's sort of the equivalent of Marxist communism. When you overthrow private property, you get this beautiful state of equality. When you overthrow all the horrible ideas that we've been brought up with over the last 500 years, what you get is a perfect culture of inclusivity and
so what's
diversity.
the end goal then for Black Lives Matter?
That's what makes it so dangerous. I was actually just thinking of this today. Like, what exactly is the end goal? There's nothing really concrete in it. It's basically just, well, I suppose they would say like total equality of outcomes, I suppose, and where everyone is accepted. The problem is that though the notion of equality of outcomes assumes that there are no good reasons why you would have different outcomes between people in the first place. So the idea that everyone should have an equal amount of stuff and everyone should have, it should be just as easy for everyone to reach a particular economic or social status sort of assumes that the only reason anyone doesn't sort of achieve that particular status is because someone is arbitrarily holding them down for some kind of, untoward reason. Systemic racism. Okay. Now, we can talk about systemic racism. And here's the thing. I mean, my position on systemic racism is that if it exists, and it's not even an easy thing to define, but if it exists in a much lower degree than what people who talk about systemic racism claim. Okay. And even if there is an element of systemic racism out there, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's sort of caused just by racism. So to take an example, in America, the stats are in about lethal encounters between the police and African Americans. Yeah. There's been a well-known study by an African American scholar at Harvard University. Yeah. You've probably seen this. It came out, I think, last year in 2019. Yeah. And even he was surprised because he thought, well, I'm going to sort out once and for all whether police officers are more likely to engage lethally, that is, with deadly weapons, with African Americans. Yeah. And what he discovered was, in actual fact,
it was the opposite.
It's the opposite. They're more likely to engage lethally with whites. But what he did find, which was quite interesting, was that police officers are more likely to engage coercively with African Americans. So a police officer, for example, is more likely to ask an African American to get out of their car, more likely to put his hands on an African American. That is more likely. Now, someone might say, systemic racism. But, let's just hold on here. Because what we also know is that African Americans, tragically, do as a generalization, commit more crimes than white people.
Yeah, that's a statistical
fact, and no one denies it. Like, no one denies it. In fact, one of the reasons people say there's a systemic problem is because of African American crime rates. That's sort of seen as evidence that there's a racial issue in America. And so if you're a police officer, what that means is that very sadly and tragically for those good, upstanding African Americans, that in your mind, because your experience has been that African Americans will tend to be a greater danger to your life, or tend to be guilty of crimes more than a white person, that will probably lead you to be more cautious and maybe even more coercive with an African American. Now, should they be like that? Well, probably not, of course, probably not. But is what's going on just simple racism? Like, I hate blacks and this is how I'm going to express it. Not necessarily. There could be understandable although, unfortunate psychological reasons grounded in the actual facts of African American crime that unfortunately lead police officers to behave that way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's much more to the story, but the point that I'm making is that systemic racism, it's not an obvious thing that's out there. And just because you have, one thing we know is that, African Americans will be more likely to be less successful economically than non-African Americans. Now, how do you explain it? Is that just racism? Well, again, that's far too simplistic.
Yeah.
Like, how about the fact that fatherlessness in African American communities is so incredibly high? I've heard estimates from between 65 to 75%.
Yeah.
Just the other week, I watched an interview with the American sort of family expert Warren Farrell, who wrote an excellent book with John Gray called The Boy Crisis, one of the best books I've read. And the figure he gave was something like 75% of African American men are fatherless.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that could have something to do with poverty in African American communities? Do you think that could have something to do with crime in African American communities? I mean, no one wants to talk about that. All people want to talk about is racism. In other words, what they want to do is kind of divide America, again, between oppressors and victims.
Which is part of that cultural Marxism narrative.
Well, that's right. I mean, I'm not saying...
Not the exclusive thing, but...
Not the exclusive thing. I mean, people were talking like that, before cultural Marxism sort of really becomes a strong factor in the way people start thinking at a more popular level. I think it really becomes quite strong. You've got it among activists, certainly in the early 70s, but it becomes more strong at a popular level, certainly in the 90s. But it's this impulse to just explain everything that might be wrong with a community in terms of it being oppressed. That is, there might not be anything else. Now, someone's going to come along now and say, Steve, but you're forgetting, or you're willfully just ignoring slavery, segregation. Now, I will be the first to admit that there is this thing called the legacy of racism, where historic racism can actually have its lingering effects in terms of economic inequality and things like that. But that's a far cry from saying that right now we have systemic racism. That's a far cry from saying that. And when you throw into the mix the fact that you've got a very generous welfare state to minorities in America, you've got generous educational scholarships for minorities in America.
As well as Australia.
And in Australia, absolutely. You've got, in Australia, it's incredible, the economic opportunities for Indigenous Australians who want to go to university. It'll basically be paid for the most part.
Well, according to the Australian, it's $33 billion per year.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. Then you've got affirmative action in the public service in both Australia and the United States. I mean, it's very hard to talk about systemic racism when you've got those things. What at best you may be dealing with is a sort of a legacy of past racism, which the state is now trying to deal with. Whether it's dealing with it in a useful way is another question. I mean, just because the state introduces these programs doesn't actually mean these programs are good for people.
Well, I think a lot of people on both sides, left or right, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, would say that it's not working. That there's still massive problems of unemployment, lack of education, alcoholism, domestic violence, sexual abuse in those communities. Despite the billions of dollars that are being spent every year to try and help these communities.
Well, it's the principle of unintended consequences, and it's the old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the fact is, sometimes you can do things with the best intentions, but it actually winds up with even worse outcomes. And so, take the welfare state, something that even in its origins, sort of, especially after the Great Depression, may have been a kind of necessary measure. I don't know, but let's even say that it was. It doesn't mean that all its effects, or even most of its effects, are going to be good. And so, what we can see happens with the expansion of the welfare state for both African Americans and non-African Americans, and it may well be the same in Australia as well, is that you, with the welfare state getting bigger, you also have increasing problems with broken families and children born out of wedlock. Why? Because when you have a welfare state that basically guarantees that the children will be looked after whether you stay there or not, that becomes a tremendous disincentive to hang around and be the father of those children. And it also removes a disincentive from a woman who may want to have a child out of wedlock, knowing that she can do that and the state will step in and fund it. Are they going to live lavishly? No. But, there are a lot of people out there who are just happy to get by. I mean, it's sad, and these are uncomfortable things to talk about.
So I would think that a lot of people listening or watching this would be saying, well, what then do we do?
Yeah.
What you're not just an ivory tower academic. You've already proven yourself to want to get your hands dirty and be involved in the politics of making change. If you had the power and the opportunity to enact change within our community in this area, what would you do in Australia?
Well, first I'd look at what's not working.
Okay.
And when you look at what's not working, and I've sort of paid attention to the Closing the Gap reports, over the last sort of 10 years or however long they've been coming out, just to see what's getting better. And generally speaking, the Closing the Gap reports in Australia, that is the reports that talk about education, health, levels among Indigenous Australians. Generally speaking, what you see is that things aren't getting a whole lot better. And probably why the Closing the Gap reports don't actually get that much media attention. Because
they're not working.
It's just not getting that much better. It really isn't. And so the first thing you want to look at is, well, what are we doing that's not working?
Okay.
The second thing is, rather than listen to the same old people who've been telling you to do the same old things, we need to pump more money into these communities, be more culturally sensitive to these communities. I'm not saying that there's no place for any of that in some degrees, but how about we listen to the voices of people who've come from those communities, who have a very different take on what's going on, and maybe give them a try. And so when you listen to people like Jacinda Price, and certain African...
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I just last week met up with Dr Anthony Dillon, who lectures at the Australian Catholic University in Strathfield.
Okay.
And he said he went to my old town where I used to live and minister in Weewar.
Yeah.
And he went to the public school there, and he met with the principal because they had the highest success rate with Indigenous Australians in their education. He said, "What's the secret?" And the principal said, without batting an eyelid, "We treat them no differently to any other child."
Yep.
And he said, "That's the key." And
that's what Jacinda Price and Anthony Dillon are saying, and that's what African American intellectuals and many conservative policy analysts in America are saying.
But it's not what the universities are saying. The universities are saying it's all, you've got to be culturally appropriate. And
and there are all sorts of reasons why that may be the case. I mean, here's the thing, once certain intellectual trends take root in a university, intellectuals are very jealous in terms of protecting their own reputations and protecting the credibility of ways of thinking. And so, if an academic has been saying for the last 20 years, this is how we need to do things, even though it's been proven to not work, often instead of saying, "Look, I was wrong, let's try something else," often what they'll double down and say, "Well, we're not doing it enough."
Right.
That's part of the problem. And now, if you're a youngster who wants to do a PhD and become an academic, you're not going to get anywhere by pushing a narrative that undermines against your supervisor, but not just against your supervisor, against the whole sort of academic industry, basically saying to them all, "You're wrong." That's not going to get you very far. And so, bad ideas perpetuate themselves.
They become entrenched?
Oh, they become entrenched. And if you want an institution where bad ideas flourish and become perpetuated and become a form of perverse common sense, it's universities. Douglas Murray talked about the madness of crowds. I would talk about the madness of academics. It is a thing where, they can just look. The classic example was communistic regimes during the 60s and 70s that people knew. People knew that people were getting killed. People knew that these regimes were not working.
Yeah.
It didn't matter. The academics basically just said, "Oh, well, you know, it's only because the West is interfering too much and making it not work." Or people, or apologists for Stalin, apologists for Pol Pot, people who just did not want to accept that the drum they had been banging for the last 20 years was a really bad drum. Maybe they were banging a bomb. I don't know. But I mean, and let me tell you right now, there is no vanity, there is no pride fiercer than intellectual pride. There is no pride more fierce. It really...
Interesting.
A little knowledge puffs up.
Yeah.
Francis Bacon said, was it Francis Bacon? I'm sure it was Bacon. I know that sort of there's an iteration of it, of course, with the Apostle Paul, but the idea that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. He said, you know, a little dabbling in philosophy brings man's mind to atheism, but going deep into philosophy brings it back to religion. But the point is that, you know, knowledge is something that can be a great source of pride, and there is no feeling more uncomfortable than when you are publicly shown to be wrong about something. That is a very uncomfortable thing, and that's often how bad ideas just remain. Now, and so look, it is not my area of expertise, but there are people, you've mentioned some of their names, Anthony Dillon and there's Jacinta Price, who have thought a lot about this, have a very different interpretation, and over in America you have scholars there as well, and they say, look, yeah, the problem is that we're infantilizing these communities.
Yeah.
We're not treating them like autonomous adults.
Yeah.
We're basically treating them like defective human beings who can't manage themselves without basically being hooked on white welfare.
Yeah.
And what you've got to do is actually, you know, lower the degree of welfare.
Well, there's a biblical principle in that too, because as the Apostle Paul says in Thessalonians, he lays down this rule in all the churches that he ministers, that if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat.
Yeah.
And in fact, he himself takes no remuneration for his own ministry, so that he can be a model to those that he's ministering to.
Yeah.
It's a very important biblical, even Judeo-Christian principle for the Old and New Testament.
Absolutely.
Of human autonomy means human responsibility.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I was actually talking to a guy the other day who teaches justice to Year 8 students at a girls' school. And when he told me, he's probably going to see this interview, I don't know, but when he told me he teaches justice to Year 8 students, chills went down my spine. Because I thought to myself, you know, justice is a very, very complicated thing. Society is very, very complicated. I don't even know that I understand what justice is. What makes you think that you understand what justice is, and what makes you think that these Year 8 students are going to understand what justice is? It's like, you know, maybe it's the kind of thing that's not...
Was he coming at it from a biblical Christian
perspective? He was coming at it from a biblical perspective. But what I noticed was that sort of the tens of the books and the verses that he was citing very easily lent themselves to sort of a leftist conception of justice. Basically, justice as equitable redistribution, sort of along the lines of a fairly big welfare state, that kind of thing. And there's, of course, those verses are valid, but like you said, very few people who talk about justice will talk about, you know, let he who does not eat, let he who does not work not eat, which is another principle of justice. It's sort of a principle of justice as desserts, in a sense.
Well, look, for my master's, I wrote on capital punishment and the ethics of capital punishment from a philosophical, biblical, pastoral perspective. Yeah. And it seemed to me that there's obviously different ways of defining justice. For instance, the classic biblical one is retribution, getting one's just deserts, being punished because that's what one deserves. Yeah. But that's really out of vogue today. There's more restorative justice in vogue. And C.S. Lewis talks about this too, historically. Your thoughts there?
Yeah, he wrote a very famous essay in favour of...
the humanitarian view of justice, I think it was called.
Okay, yeah, and he basically argued that... Well, one of the arguments from memory that he made was that modern views of justice and modern views of punishment, talking about capital punishment, are actually unjust. The idea that you could punish someone as a deterrent for other people is thoroughly unjust, because you're punishing people for other people's that other people might be likely to sin if you don't punish them, which Lewis thought was a crazy idea. If you're going to punish people, punish them for something they've done, not for what other people might do. But we certainly don't live in an age of punishment anymore, because punishment involves the concept of right and wrong, and sort of the Latin notion of a pena. That's where the sort of word for punishment comes from, a kind of almost a metaphysical notion that you have gone beyond some kind of law and
a divine lawgiver,
or a natural law,
transgressed
something not created by politicians and lawyers.
Something outside of themselves,
something outside of the state. And so we've gravitated more towards rehabilitation. But that's absolutely true. But can I just say, in terms of sort of the question of Indigenous Australians and African Americans, I let me say right now, I do not advocate just turning off the welfare cold turkey. I don't advocate that, because you might find that the consequences of that are quite disastrous as well. And so what we're looking at is a situation in which what we're doing isn't working. It has to change. The question then becomes how to, and the change may be actually generating independence through, over time, weaning people off welfare. That's something that, look, I can't see the positive change taking place over anything less than the next 25 to 30 years. And it's actually really tragic when you look at many of these communities, and you look at the young children, and you look at the families that they're growing up in, and you just look at them and you see people. It's
like watching a train wreck.
It's like watching a train wreck. There is nothing you can do. Let me. So I don't advocate cold turkey. I'm not saying that at all. But you know my honest opinion. I don't believe necessarily that all problems can be solved. Where does it say in the stars? Where does it say in the Bible that you can solve all problems here on Earth? That doesn't mean you can't ameliorate problems, make them better.
But I think what you're saying is, like, for instance, Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. It doesn't mean that we don't have a responsibility to help the poor, but we need to understand that it'll never be, like you say, ameliorated.
Well, it could be ameliorated. It's just never going to be completely eradicated. It's never going to be completely solved. But my honest view is that the best chance of solving the issue of poverty and just the horrible realities that so many Indigenous Australians face is actually, to me, it could be the great task of the church in Australia. What I mean is that if churches in Australia basically made a point of every church funding some kind of missionary / serious Christian worker in these regions there to form relationships, if every church just put part of their budget aside, maybe several of them in an area funded an individual, I actually think that would be the best hope in the long period of changing these communities. People who see it as their divine vocation to go in, live in Indigenous communities, live close to Indigenous communities, and in it basically living a life that is incredibly attractive to enough Indigenous Australians where their lives start to change too, and it becomes contagious. Again, it's something over a long period. There have been studies done of the positive impact that churches have had in Indigenous communities.
Missions in Australia.
Exactly, missions in Australia. And I'm not talking about historical missions. I'm talking about missions that have happened very recently, and the very positive impact that they've had on Indigenous communities. And so I guess what I'm saying is, to be perfectly honest, I think that the gospel is actually central to the future well-being of Indigenous Australians. I honestly think what they need is the gospel. I think that's what they need. And I think that would be the great miracle that churches could perform in Australia, because it would be a miracle. A miracle is sort of something completely completely unexpected, that appears to be outside of the realm of the laws of nature, if you like. If Christians and churches were able to fund people to go into those communities in large numbers, I honestly think that over time there would be an incredible improvement in those communities. And it is something that the state bureaucrats and academics have not been able to solve. It's sort of outside of sort of the natural laws of our secular institutions. But I think that is the answer. And I think that churches would be literally, in a way, performing a national miracle if they did that.
Yeah, look, wise words. I think you're right. And love to hear more. Maybe we can come back on another episode and dig more deeply into that.